Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air inside the Curia of Pompeii on the 15th of March, 44 BCE, was thick with more than just the scent of wool and perfumed oil. It was heavy with anticipation, a low hum of energy that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. The business of the day was petitions, the mundane machinery of the Roman state. Senators, nearly 200 of them, milled about, their voices echoing off the marble floors, their white togas trimmed with the purple stripe of their station a sea of manufactured calm. But beneath the fabric of tradition, another fabric was being woven, one of sharp steel and desperate ideology. Concealed within the folds of those respectable togas were daggers, their cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the bodies that carried them. Gaius Julius Caesar was late. At 55 years old, he was the master of the known world, a man who had conquered Gaul, defeated his rivals in a brutal civil war, and returned to Rome not as a mere general, but as something new, something terrifying to the old guard, a dictator for life. That morning he had nearly stayed home. His wife, Calpurnia, had been tormented by nightmares, visions of him bleeding in her arms. The priests who read the entrails of sacrificial animals had reported dire omens, and the soothsayer, Spurina, had warned him days before with chilling simplicity to beware the Ides of March. The day had come, and Caesar, a man who prided himself on his rationalism, had mocked the prophet, noting that the Ides had arrived and he was still well. "I, Caesar," the soothsayer is said to have replied, "but not yet gone." It was one of his most trusted men, Decimus Brutus, who finally coaxed him from his home, shaming him with talk of the Senate's eagerness to bestow upon him yet more honors. As Caesar entered the Curia, a crowd pressed in. A teacher of Greek philosophy named Artemidorus tried to hand him a scroll, a detailed list of the conspirators and their entire plot. But in the crush of petitioners, Caesar simply passed the unread warning to an attendant. He took his seat on his gilded chair, a symbol of the very power his colleagues had come to resent. The plan was in motion. The conspirators moved to surround him, pretending to support a petition brought by one of their own, Lucius Tullius Cimber, who pleaded for the return of his exiled brother. Cimber knelt before Caesar, and as a sign of supplication, he grasped the dictator's purple toga. Pulling it down from his neck, this was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca, positioned behind Caesar, drew his dagger. He aimed for the neck, but his nerve faltered. The blade sliced across Caesar's shoulder, a shallow, painful wound. Caesar spun around, shocked, and cried out in Latin, "Vile Casca, what is this?" He impaled Casca's arm with his stylus, the sharp metal pen he used for writing, a writer's weapon against a killer's. For a moment he fought back, but then the others descended. The circle of friends and colleagues became a pack of wolves. Blades flashed from all sides. He saw men he had pardoned, men he had promoted, men who owed their careers to his patronage. And then, through the blur of blood and betrayal, he saw him, Marcus Junius Brutus, the son of his former mistress, a man he had treated like a son of his own. The sight broke his will to fight. He pulled his toga up over his head, resigning himself to his fate, and fell at the base of a statue of his great rival, Pompey the Great. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect a murder that reshaped the course of Western civilization. We are examining the anatomy of a political conspiracy, a meticulously planned act of violence carried out not by common criminals, but by the intellectual and political elite of their day. We will explore how idealism curdled into assassination, how personal ambition and genuine principle became inseparable, and how the act of killing one man to save a republic ultimately guaranteed its destruction. To understand the crime, we must first understand the victim, not merely as a man, but as a political force that the Roman Republic was no longer equipped to handle. Gaius Julius Caesar was a product of the Republic's dying days, a brilliant and ambitious aristocrat from an old but not particularly wealthy patrician family. He was a master of public relations, a charismatic populist who championed the cause of the common people against the entrenched power of the senatorial elite, known as the Optimates. His political career was a masterclass in leveraging popular support and military might to achieve unprecedented power. His early alliance with two of Rome's other titans, Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, formed the first triumvirate. This was an unofficial but immensely powerful political pact that allowed the three men to bypass the traditional checks and balances of the Senate. Caesar used this alliance to secure for himself the governorship of Gaul, which at the time was a collection of tribal territories in modern-day France, Belgium, and Switzerland. For nearly a decade, he waged a series of brilliant and brutal campaigns, conquering the region for Rome, killing or enslaving millions, and amassing an obscene personal fortune. More importantly, he forged a veteran army that was fanatically loyal not to the state, but to him personally. His legions were his power base, and they would follow him anywhere. The Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, grew terrified of his power. They saw a man whose ambition had no ceiling. In 49 BCE, they issued an ultimatum: disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for his actions as governor. For Caesar, this was a death sentence, both politically and perhaps literally. His response was a single, irrevocable act of treason. He led his 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of his province. To cross it with an army was a declaration of war against the state. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" has since become a metaphor for passing a point of no return, and for Caesar it was exactly that. The civil war that followed was swift and decisive. Caesar's hardened legions crushed the forces of Pompey and the Senate across the globe, from Spain to Greece to Egypt. He returned to Rome in 45 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The traditional republican system, with its elected consuls serving one-year terms, and its powerful but deliberative Senate, was shattered. In its place was Caesar. He began to accumulate titles and honors at a dizzying rate: consul for 10 years, prefect of morals, and finally, in early 44 BCE, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. In the Roman psyche, the word king or rex was poison. The Republic had been founded 5 centuries earlier on the expulsion of its last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. The entire political structure was designed to prevent any one man from ever accumulating that much power again. Yet here was Caesar, holding absolute authority for life. He wasn't just a political leader. He was beginning to look and act like a Hellenistic monarch. He had his image placed on coins, a privilege previously reserved for gods or dead ancestors. A temple was planned to honor his clemency. His statue was placed among those of the ancient kings of Rome on the Capitoline Hill. He wore a triumphal purple robe at all times and sat upon a gilded throne in the Senate House. Perhaps the most infamous incident occurred at the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BCE, just 1 month before his death. His loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, publicly offered him a diadem, the symbol of a king. Caesar, perhaps sensing the hostile mood of the crowd, refused it 3 times, to theatrical applause. But for many senators watching, the damage was done. Whether it was a genuine test of public opinion or a piece of political theater, it looked like a man flirting with monarchy. For the blue-blooded aristocrats of the Senate, men who saw themselves as the rightful guardians of Roman liberty, this was the final, unforgivable transgression. They saw their own power, their wealth, and their entire way of life being subsumed by the cult of personality surrounding one man. Caesar's populism was a threat, his reforms were a threat, but his ambition was an existential crisis for the republic they claimed to serve. He was not just changing the government, he was ending their world. The conspiracy against Caesar was not a sudden eruption of anger. It was a slow-growing cancer within his own government, composed of men who smiled at him in the Senate and sharpened their blades at home. At the heart of this network were 2 profoundly different yet equally driven individuals, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. They were the architects of the assassination, the ideological and practical engines of the plot. Gaius Cassius Longinus was the likely instigator, the organizational mastermind. He was a seasoned military commander and a staunch, if bitter, Republican. He had a personal history with Caesar that was laced with professional rivalry and political opposition. Cassius had fought for Pompey during the Civil War, commanding a naval fleet against Caesar's forces. After Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus, Cassius was among the many enemies Caesar had famously pardoned. This act of clemency, a cornerstone of Caesar's political strategy, was meant to heal the wounds of the Civil War and co-opt his former opponents. But for a man like Cassius, pardon was a form of humiliation. It was a constant reminder of his defeat and his dependence on the dictator's goodwill. He was a proud, irascible man, a follower of the Epicurean school of philosophy, which, contrary to popular belief, did not promote hedonism, but a rational and detached approach to life. He saw Caesar not as a benevolent leader, but as a tyrant whose unchecked power was an affront to the natural order of the Roman state. His motivation was a potent mix of personal resentment and ideological conviction. He hated the man, but he also genuinely hated what the man represented. If Cassius was the plot's dark heart, Marcus Junius Brutus was its soul. Brutus provided the conspiracy with something it desperately needed: moral legitimacy. His name was a symbol. He was a direct descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Roman Republic, who had driven out the last king in 509 BCE. This lineage was both a source of immense pride and a crushing burden. Throughout Rome, graffiti began to appear, scrawled on walls and on the praetor's chair where Brutus sat as a magistrate. "Brutus, are you asleep?" one read. Another, "You are no true Brutus." The public was calling on him to live up to his ancestors' legacy. Brutus's relationship with Caesar was deeply personal and painfully complex. Like Cassius, he had sided with Pompey in the Civil War, a decision made more on principle than personal loyalty, as Pompey had been responsible for his father's death years earlier. After the defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar not only pardoned Brutus, but actively sought him out on the battlefield to ensure his safety. He showered Brutus with honors, making him governor of Gaul, and then a praetor. There was a genuine affection, at least from Caesar's side. Caesar had famously carried on a long and public affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia, a fact that led to persistent, though likely baseless, rumors that Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son. Brutus was a student of Stoic philosophy, which emphasized duty, virtue, and acting in accordance with reason for the greater good. He agonized over his decision. To kill Caesar was to betray a benefactor, a friend, a man who had shown him nothing but kindness and promotion. But to let Caesar live, to let him become a king, was to betray the Republic, to betray his ancestors, and to betray his own philosophical principles. In the end, for Brutus, the abstract ideal of the Republic outweighed the personal bond. He was convinced by Cassius and his own conscience that Caesar's death was a necessary, if tragic, act of political surgery. He believed he was not a murderer, but a liberator. His involvement transformed the conspiracy from a simple coup into a noble crusade in the eyes of its participants. He was the justification they all needed to commit a terrible crime. With Brutus and Cassius at its core, the conspiracy grew, eventually swelling to include somewhere between 60 and 80 senators. It was a remarkably diverse group, a testament to the breadth of the anti-Caesarine sentiment among the elite. It included staunch old guard Republicans who had opposed Caesar from the beginning. But it also included many of Caesar's own men, so-called Caesarians, who had fought alongside him in Gaul and the Civil War. These were men who had benefited immensely from his rise, but had come to fear that his ambition would leave no room for their own. One of the most critical conspirators was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. He is often confused with the more famous Marcus Brutus, but his role was arguably more important from a tactical standpoint. Decimus was no philosopher. He was a top-tier general, one of Caesar's most trusted commanders and closest friends. He had served Caesar faithfully for years. His betrayal was not born of abstract ideals, but of a pragmatic fear that Caesar was consolidating too much power and sidelining his most capable lieutenants. Caesar trusted Decimus so completely that he had named him in his will as a secondary heir, set to inherit his fortune if his primary heir, Octavian, died. Decimus was the ultimate insider. His presence in the plot gave the conspirators invaluable access and intelligence, and on the fateful day, it was his voice that would lure the lamb to the slaughter. This collection of idealists, opportunists, bitter rivals, and treacherous friends formed a fragile but deadly coalition, united by a single, terrifying purpose. The planning of the assassination was a masterclass in covert operations, conducted under the constant threat of discovery. In a city rife with spies and informants, where political allegiances were fluid and betrayal was commonplace, the fact that a conspiracy involving over 60 prominent men remained a secret is nothing short of astonishing. They held their meetings not in public forums, but in the private homes of the conspirators under the cover of darkness. Every whispered conversation, every clandestine gathering, carried the risk of execution. They were, after all, plotting to kill the head of state, a man who, while famously clement to his open enemies, was not known for tolerating sedition from within his own ranks. The conspirators debated every detail with painstaking precision, understanding that a single misstep would mean their ruin. A key decision was the method of the killing. They could have used poison or hired a lone assassin, methods that would have offered a degree of plausible deniability. But they chose something far more public and far more symbolic: death by a multitude of stab wounds, delivered by their own hands. This choice was deliberate and deeply ideological. It was to be a collective act, a ritualistic sacrifice for the good of the state. By having each conspirator inflict a wound, no single man could be branded the sole murderer. They would all share in the act, and therefore in the glory. They would not be assassins skulking in the shadows. They would be liberatores, liberators, acting openly on behalf of the Roman people. Their weapon of choice was the pugio, a short, double-edged dagger. It was small enough to be easily concealed within the voluminous folds of a senatorial toga, making it the perfect tool for an attack in a crowded, public setting. The location was another point of critical debate. They needed a place where Caesar would be vulnerable, a setting that would lend their act political legitimacy. They considered ambushing him on the Via Sacra, Rome's main street, or during the upcoming elections. But they ultimately settled on the Curia of Pompey, a Senate meeting house located within the larger complex of the Theater of Pompey. The choice was dripping with irony. Caesar would be struck down at the foot of a statue of his greatest rival, Pompey the Great, the very man he had defeated to achieve his supreme power. More practically, it was a restricted space. Only senators would be allowed inside, limiting the risk of interference from Caesar's bodyguards or a spontaneous popular uprising. Furthermore, Decimus Brutus, the trusted insider, owned a troop of gladiators whose barracks were in the theater complex. They could be called upon as a private security force if the assassination went awry, or if Caesar's supporters tried to intervene. The timing was perhaps the most crucial element of all. The conspirators were working against a ticking clock. Caesar was planning to depart Rome on March 18th for a massive multi-year military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. This was a campaign designed to avenge the humiliating defeat of his former triumvir, Crassus, a decade earlier. If Caesar were to leave Rome and embark on this campaign, his position would become unassailable. A victorious general, returning with new conquests and legions even more devoted to him, would be impossible to dislodge. He would be a living god. The conspirators knew they had to act before he left. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They chose the date of a Senate meeting just 3 days before his scheduled departure. The Ides of March, March 15th. The trap was set. The date, the location, and the method were all chosen to transform a brutal murder into a political statement, a public execution of a man they had judged to be a tyrant. The morning of the Ides of March dawned with an air of profound dread. The series of ill omens that plagued Caesar's household were not just literary embellishments by later historians. They reflected a genuine tension that had gripped the city. Rumors of plots were swirling. Caesar himself seemed unusually hesitant, troubled by his wife Calpurnia's terrifying nightmares and the uniformly negative reports from the augurs. He performed his own sacrifices, and the results were said to be headless victims. The worst possible sign: he was on the verge of canceling the Senate meeting altogether, an act that would have unraveled the entire conspiracy. This was the moment where the plot nearly failed, and where the value of having an insider like Decimus Brutus became terrifyingly clear. When Caesar's attendants informed the waiting senators that the dictator was unwell and would not be attending, the conspirators were thrown into a panic. Their one perfect chance was about to evaporate. Decimus was dispatched to Caesar's home. There he employed a carefully crafted argument, a mix of friendly ridicule and political flattery. He scoffed at the superstitions, asking Caesar if he, the great conqueror, was truly going to be swayed by a woman's dreams and the giblets of a bird. He then played to Caesar's ego, reminding him that the senators were gathered specifically to vote on a proposal to grant him the right to be called king outside of Italy, a crucial power for his upcoming Eastern campaign. To snub them now, Decimus argued, would be a grave insult. The persuasion worked. Caesar, His pride pricked and his sense of duty appealed to, agreed to go. Decimus had personally led his friend out of safety and into the hands of his killers. As Caesar's litter was carried toward the theater of Pompey, the final layers of his security were peeled away by the conspirators' meticulous planning. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul, and a formidable physical presence, was deliberately intercepted at the entrance to the Curia by one of the plotters, Gaius Trebonius, who engaged him in a lengthy, contrived conversation. This crucial move isolated Caesar from his most powerful and capable defender. Inside, the trap was sprung. As Tullius Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga, the designated signal, the assassins closed in. The attack itself was a scene of brutal, chaotic violence. The first blow from Casca was clumsy, striking only a glancing wound on the shoulder. This initial failure momentarily gave Caesar a chance to fight back. He was a seasoned soldier, a man in excellent physical condition for his age. He wielded his stylus, a surprisingly effective pointed weapon, and stabbed Casca in the arm. For a brief instant, it seemed he might fend them off, but then the sheer number of assailants overwhelmed him. It was a frenzy of slashing and stabbing. In the chaos, some of the conspirators even wounded each other by mistake. The act they had envisioned as a clean, righteous execution devolved into a bloody, desperate scrum. According to the historian Suetonius, it was the sight of Marcus Junius Brutus, dagger in hand, that finally extinguished Caesar's will to live. The traditional account gives us the famous line, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus," delivered in Latin. However, Suetonius, writing over a century later, claims that sources closer to the event reported Caesar's last words were actually spoken in Greek, the language of the Roman elite, "Kai su teknon," you too, my child. Whether he said anything at all is a matter of historical debate. Some accounts claim he died in silence, but the sentiment, regardless of the words, is what resonates. The betrayal by Brutus was the final, fatal wound, not to his body, but to his spirit. He ceased his struggle, covered his face with his toga in a final act of Roman dignity, and collapsed, bleeding out from 23 separate stab wounds. In the aftermath, a formal autopsy was conducted by a physician named Antistius, one of the earliest recorded post-mortem examinations in history. His professional conclusion was stark. Of the 23 wounds inflicted upon Caesar, only one had been definitively lethal. It was the second wound he received, a deep puncture to the chest that likely pierced his heart or lungs. This grim forensic detail speaks volumes. It reveals that the assassination was not the work of a single, skilled killer. It was a collective act of savagery, a storm of blows from men who were senators, not soldiers, many of whom were likely driven more by panic and fervor than by deadly precision. Their goal was not just to kill him, but for all of them to have a hand in the killing, to share the responsibility for the deed that they believed would set Rome free. The silence that followed Caesar's fall was immediate and profound. The conspirators, their daggers dripping with blood, stood in stunned disbelief. They had done it. They had slain the tyrant. Marcus Brutus raised his bloody weapon and tried to make a speech to the remaining senators, to proclaim the restoration of liberty, but he was met with a scene of pure pandemonium. The senators who were not part of the plot, horrified witnesses to the brutal murder, scrambled for the exits, screaming and tripping over one another in a desperate stampede to escape the charnel house. The liberators' grand vision of being hailed as heroes by a grateful Senate and a joyous populace instantly collided with a grim and terrified reality. They had expected acclamation. They received only fear and chaos. They marched from the Curia to the Capitoline Hill, the traditional religious and political heart of Rome, holding their bloody daggers aloft and shouting, "Liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead." But the streets were eerily empty. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows. Citizens locked themselves in their homes. The city did not erupt in celebration. It held its breath in terror, waiting to see what would come next. The liberators had successfully killed a man, but they had no coherent plan for what to do with the power they had just seized. They had surgically removed the head of the Roman state, but they had given no thought to what would replace it, assuming naively that the old republic would simply spring back to life. This political vacuum was swiftly and brilliantly exploited by the one man the conspirators had strategically spared. Mark Antony. Cassius had argued that Antony, Caesar's fiercely loyal and popular co-consul, should be killed alongside the dictator, but Marcus Brutus, in a fateful act of idealistic restraint, had refused. He argued that their cause was just, a strike against tyranny, not a bloody political purge. Sparing Antony, he believed, would prove their noble intentions. It would prove to be their single greatest mistake. Antony, after his initial shock, began to maneuver with breathtaking political skill. He secured Caesar's official papers, and, most importantly, his will. He negotiated a tense truce with the conspirators, agreeing to an amnesty for them in the Senate in exchange for the ratification of all of Caesar's acts and a public funeral. The conspirators, desperate for legitimacy, agreed. The funeral was Antony's stage, and he delivered the performance of a lifetime, standing before the Roman populace, with Caesar's bloody hacked-up corpse on display. He delivered a masterful oration, while feigning adherence to the amnesty and acknowledging the honorable men who had killed Caesar. He systematically dismantled their justification. He reminded the crowd of Caesar's military glories, his generosity, and his love for the common people. The masterstroke was the reading of Caesar's will. The crowd listened as Antony revealed that Caesar had left a sum of 75 drachmas to every single Roman citizen, and had bequeathed his vast, beautiful private gardens on the banks of the Tiber River to the public as a park. In that moment, Caesar was no longer a tyrant in the eyes of the people. He was a martyred father, a benevolent patron slain by a cabal of jealous, backstabbing aristocrats. The mood of the crowd turned from grief to incandescent rage. A riot erupted. The mob, armed with torches plucked from the funeral pyre, surged through the forum, seeking to burn down the houses of the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius and the others were forced to flee Rome for their lives, their dream of a restored republic already turning into a nightmare. Their nightmare was about to get worse, and its name was Octavian. As the city descended into chaos, Caesar's designated heir arrived in Italy. He was Caesar's grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, a sickly and bookish 19-year-old who had been away studying in Greece. Upon learning of his adoption in Caesar's will, he took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He was almost universally underestimated, seen as a mere boy by political heavyweights like Antony and Cicero, but behind his frail exterior was a mind of icy ambition and political genius that rivaled and perhaps even surpassed that of his great-uncle. Octavian played his hand perfectly. He used his new name, the name of Caesar, to rally the support of Caesar's veteran legions, who saw in him the embodiment of their murdered general. He paid the legacies in Caesar's will to the Roman people, using his own money when Antony withheld the state funds, a move that made him immensely popular. He had created a power base from nothing. The political landscape fractured. The liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, raised armies in the eastern provinces. In Rome, Antony and Octavian circled each other warily, their initial alliance of convenience against the Senate quickly souring into a rivalry for supreme power. This rivalry eventually led to the formation of the Second Triumvirate, a formal 5-year military dictatorship consisting of Octavian, Mark Antony, and a lesser general named Lepidus. Unlike the First Triumvirate, this was not a private agreement. It was a legal institution with the power to make law without reference to the Senate or the people. Their first order of business was to hunt down their enemies. They instituted proscriptions, publishing death lists of hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy equestrians. The assassins of Caesar were at the top of the list. In 43 BCE, the Triumvirate passed the Lex Pedia, a law that formally outlawed all of Caesar's murderers and declared them enemies of the state. The manhunt was on. Over the next year, one by one, the conspirators were hunted down and killed. Not a single one is recorded to have died of natural causes. The final act of the drama played out in northern Greece in 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi. The combined armies of Antony and Octavian faced the forces of Brutus and Cassius. It was the last stand of the Roman Republic. After a pair of brutal battles, the triumvirate was victorious. Cassius, misinformed that his own camp had been captured, ordered his servant to kill him. 3 weeks later, with his own army defeated, Marcus Brutus ran upon his own sword. The dream of the liberators died with them in the Macedonian dust. Their great gamble to save the Republic had resulted only in their own destruction and another even more catastrophic civil war. The anatomy of this conspiracy reveals a profound and tragic miscalculation. The liberators believed that the Roman Republic was a system, and that Caesar was a disease infecting that system. They thought that by surgically removing the man, they could restore the body politic to health. They were fundamentally wrong. Caesar was not the disease. He was a symptom. The Republic had been dying for 100 years, hollowed out by endemic corruption, vast economic inequality, and the rise of professional armies whose loyalty belonged to their charismatic generals, not to the faceless authority of the Senate. The old system was simply incapable of governing a sprawling multicultural empire. It was a political framework designed for a small city-state, and it had been stretched to the breaking point. The conspirators, particularly Brutus, were idealists trying to turn back the clock. They looked to the past, to a semi-mythical version of a virtuous republic, and believed they could resurrect it through a single act of political violence. But the forces of history, the deep structural problems facing Rome, could not be solved with a dagger. Their actions did not restore the old order. They merely annihilated what was left of it, clearing the way for something new to be born from the ashes. The power vacuum they created was not filled by a revitalized Senate, but by a new generation of ruthless warlords. The final civil war that followed the Battle of Philippi, this time between Antony and Octavian, would be the last, when Octavian finally defeated Antony and his lover, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. He returned to Rome as its sole undisputed master, just as his great-uncle had been. But Octavian was a far more subtle and cunning politician. He learned from Caesar's mistakes. He did not call himself king or dictator for life. Instead, he carefully maintained the facade of the Republic, keeping the Senate and the old magistracies intact, while methodically gathering all true power into his own hands. He called himself princeps or first citizen. The Senate, in gratitude for the peace he had brought, bestowed upon him the honorific title of Augustus. The Roman Republic was dead. The Roman Empire had begun. The ultimate irony of the Ides of March is that the assassins achieved the exact opposite of their stated goal. In their attempt to prevent one man from becoming a king, they unleashed a torrent of chaos and bloodshed that could only be ended by the absolute rule of another. They acted to preserve the liberty of the aristocracy, but instead created an emperor. The 23 wounds that felled Julius Caesar did more than kill a man. They were the death throes of a 500-year-old republic. The liberators acted to prevent a king, but the blood they spilled on the Senate floor only served to water the seeds of an empire. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.